The wind had a way of howling through the bitter ridge pines that made a man feel small. Jonas Hale had lived with that sound for years, alone in his cabin where the mountains broke the sky and storms claimed what they wanted. He had long since learned not to expect visitors, especially in weather like this. That night the snow came hard, driven sideways, thick enough to swallow the trees whole. Jonas had the fire stacked high, the kettle warming, his knife in hand as he worked a steady rhythm on the whetstone. The cabin was warm and quiet, save for the storm's constant scream outside. Then came the sound. At first faint, nearly lost in the roar. 3 knocks. Jonas froze, knife still in hand. Out here, no man or woman traveled in such a storm unless death was already at their heels. He rose, crossed the room in 3 strides, and pulled the chimo. Door wide, the wind slapped in, carrying snow and shadow. A woman stood there, her shawl stiff with ice, hair plastered to her face. 3 children clung to her skirts, bent beneath scarves and worn coats. The smallest whimpered, and that sound cut sharper than the gale. Jonas stepped aside. Get in. The woman staggered through the doorway, nearly dragging the little one. The 2 older children stumbled behind, faces pale with cold. Jonas slammed the door shut, shutting out the storm. Inside, the cabin suddenly felt too small for so much need. He pulled chairs close to the hearth. Sit, get warm. The woman obeyed, fumbling with scarves and stiff coats. The oldest boy, 10, maybe helped his sister, jaw tight. The little one clung, mittens stiff as wood. Jonas disappeared into the back room and returned with wool blankets. He draped them over the children, then set the kettle nearer the fire. When steam rose, he poured chipped mugs full and handed one to the woman. "Ain't much," he muttered. "Better than the cold." Her fingers trembled as she took it. "Thank you," she whispered, voice raw. Jonas only grunted. He stirred the fire, sparks leaping. Then, after a moment, asked, "How far you come?" Her eyes went to the children, who were already curling into the blankets. 3 days, east of Bitter Hollow. Wagon broke. Walked. The rest, Jonas's jaw tightened. Why? She swallowed hard. Had to, she said at last. He didn't press. A man who lived alone as long as Jonas had knew better than to dig where the ground wasn't ready. He leaned back against the table, arms crossed, watching them with the careful eye of one used to reading strangers at length. He offered, "Jonas Hale." "Eliza Cooper," she replied softly. She touched each child in turn. "Nathan, Leah, Ben." Jonas nodded. His gaze lingered on the smallest boy, whose tiny hand clutched his mother's skirt even in sleep. Something in his chest shifted, but he said nothing. "You're safe here," he said instead. His voice was steady, certain. "Storm won't pass tonight, and neither will you." Relief hit her so strong she nearly wept. She didn't. She only tightened the blanket around her children and whispered, "Thank you." Jonas returned to his chair, knife forgotten on the table. The fire cracked, throwing warmth across the room. Outside, the storm battered the walls. But inside, for the first time in years, his cabin wasn't empty. It wasn't peace. Not yet, but it was something close. Morning came slow. A pale light pressed through frost-rimmed windows. The storm had not ended, but it had softened, its rage reduced to a steady hiss. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, casting the room in a dim orange glow. Eliza stirred. First, her back ached from sleeping upright in the chair, but her eyes went straight to her children. Nathan, Leah, and Ben were still bundled in blankets, their cheeks pink now from warmth instead of frost. Nathan had curled his arm protectively around his younger sister, while Ben's small hand rested on Leah's shoulder as if to anchor himself. Relief struck Eliza so sharply it nearly undid her. She rose quietly, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. The cabin was plain but cared for tools neatly lined along the wall. A shelf of worn books, a table scarred by use but clean. It was not the home she had left behind, but it carried the order of a man who lived with purpose, even in solitude. From outside came the steady thud of wood splitting. Eliza opened the door carefully. The cold nipped at her face, but she stood watching. Jonas Hale was on the porch, axe in hand, working with clean, practiced strokes. Snow dusted his shoulders, his breath clouded the air, but he paid it no mind. "You don't have to do that." "For us," Eliza said softly. Jonas didn't look at her. "Not doing it for you, doing it for the stove. Stove don't care who's hungry, just needs wood to burn." A faint smile touched her lips. She recognized the kind men who wore kindness under rough words. Still, she stepped forward, gathering the split wood into her arms. "You could have stayed inside," Jonas said, finally glancing at her. "I've been sitting too long," she answered. "Feels better to move." He gave a short nod, and together they stacked the wood. Neither spoke much, but the silence wasn't heavy. By the time the woodpile was replenished, the sky had lightened to dull silver. Jonas jerked his chin toward the door. Coffees. Still warm. Inside, the children had begun to stir. Nathan stretched, yawning, while Leah rubbed her eyes. Ben peeked from beneath the blanket, cautious but awake. Jonas poured 2 tin cups of coffee, black and bitter, and handed one to Eliza. She cradled it gratefully, the heat seeping into her cold fingers. For a long while they sat across from one another, the children whispering near the fire. Then Jonas spoke. "You planning to move on when the storm breaks?" Eliza hesitated. She stared into the dark surface of her coffee. "I thought I would. Had family west, or thought I did." Letters stopped coming long before winter. Jonas nodded, no judgment in his eyes. "You ain't the first to think west held all the answers. Most times all you find is more questions." Their eyes met across the table. For a moment, something passed between them, an understanding of people who had both been left behind by the world. Later that day, the cabin grew livelier. Nathan followed Jonas outside, eager to help with chores. The boy hauled small armloads of wood, broke ice in the water trough, and listened as Jonas showed him how to hold an axe without wasting strength. Leah stayed with her mother, patching mittens with awkward stitches and asking quiet questions about their host. Ben shadowed Jonas everywhere, his small voice piping up with endless curiosity. "What's that knife for? Do bears come here? Can I ride a horse someday?" Jonas answered each one, gruff but patient. For the first time in a long time, his cabin echoed with something besides the wind. It echoed with life. That night, after the stew was finished and the children tucked near the fire, Eliza lifted her gaze to Jonas. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Thank you for letting us stay. For not asking too much." Jonas looked at her, then at the children. bundled close. "Didn't seem like you needed more questions," he said. "Seemed like you needed rest." Eliza's throat tightened. She lowered her eyes, whispering, "I did." The storm hissed against the walls, but inside the cabin, the silence settled easy. By the third day, the storm had broken. The sky hung low and gray, but the snow had stopped, leaving the world white and still. Smoke rose steady from Jonas Hale's chimney, a thin column against the heavy clouds. Inside, the cabin no longer felt like the refuge of one man. It carried the restless energy of children. Nathan practiced with the axe under Jonas's eye, learning how to let the blade fall with weight instead of wasted muscle. Leah hummed as she braided scraps of yarn into her doll's hair. Ben followed Jonas through the cabin and out into the yard, peppering him with questions. Each answer came gruff but patient. Eliza watched it all with a quiet amazement. It had been so long since her children had looked safe, so long since she herself had felt it. Still, safety was a thin thread. She knew storms came in more shapes than snow. That evening, as the stew bubbled over the fire, Jonas sat at the table, whittling. A small figure from a block of wood. His hands were steady, movements precise. The shape emerged slowly, a bird with outstretched wings. "You carve well," Eliza said softly. Jonas glanced up. "Something to do when the wind won't stop howling." Eliza studied him for a moment. Longer, then said, "I think you're kinder than you let on." He didn't smile, not exactly, but the corners of his mouth twitched. For Jonas Hale, that was plenty. The children settled quickly after supper, exhausted from the day. Eliza remained at the table, her cup in hand, shadows dancing across her face. Jonas stirred the fire, then sat opposite her. "You've been running," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Eliza's hand tightened around the cup. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, with a breath, she spoke. "Matthew left us. Said he was going for supplies, but he never came back. Just left us in Bitter Hollow with half a sack of flour. And nothing else." Her voice cracked. "I thought he was dead. Maybe I hoped he was. But I heard things. He wasn't gone, not really. He just didn't want us anymore." Jonas's jaw tightened, the lines of his face sharpening in the firelight. He didn't curse, didn't spit, but his silence carried its own weight. 3 days I walked," Eliza continued, her voice low. The children nearly froze. "If not for your light," she stopped, unable to finish. Jonas leaned back, crossing his arms. "He come looking, he'll find you here." Eliza's gaze flicked to the children, sleeping soundly by the hearth. Fear traced across her face. "Then what do I do?" Jonas didn't answer right away. He stared at the flame's jaw. Set. At last, he said, "You stay. At least till you've got strength. If he comes, he won't take you easy." The words hung in the air, simple but solid. Eliza felt something loosen in her chest, though fear still gnawed. The next morning brought a rare brightness, the clouds lifting just enough to let the sun through. The children laughed as they played. Near the cabin, their voices ringing out across the snow. Eliza stepped outside to watch, her shawl drawn tight. Jonas stood near the woodpile, axe in hand, but his eyes followed the children. "They're happy here," Eliza said. "They should be," Jonas replied. He didn't look at her, but the truth in his voice was plain. For a fleeting moment, it felt almost like a home. But shadows don't stay buried forever, and Eliza knew the past had a way of finding its way back. By the end of the week, the land had begun to thaw. Icicles dripped from the eaves, and the snow, though still deep, no longer fell with the fury of before. Jonas had fallen into a rhythm with Eliza, and the children chores done side by side. Meals shared, quiet evenings by the fire. For the first time in months, Eliza let herself breathe without fear pressing down on her chest. Nathan learned to split wood straight and true. Leah patched mittens with steadier hands, and Ben's laughter rang like bells in the cabin. Jonas, though sparing with words, never sent them away. His silences had softened, no longer barriers, but spaces where comfort lived. But peace in the frontier was never promised for long. That afternoon, Jonas was repairing a fence rail that had cracked under snow when he heard it hoofbeats, steady and confident. He straightened, narrowing his eyes toward the tree line. One rider appeared, tall and lean, dressed in a coat finer than these mountains ever needed. Behind him came two more. Jonas's gut hardened. Men like that didn't come by accident. He stepped out of the barn, axe still in his hand, as the first rider reined in. The man removed his hat with deliberate slowness, revealing slick dark hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well now," the stranger drawled, "a cabin in the woods. What luck." Jonas said nothing. He only squared his shoulders, waiting. The cabin door creaked behind him. Eliza stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. At the sight of the man on horseback, her face went pale. "Matthew," she whispered. The man's smile widened. "So you haven't forgotten me, Eliza?" Jonas didn't need more. He saw it plain in her eyes, the fear, the old wound. This was the one who had left her to freeze in Bitter Hollow. Matthew Crowley dismounted with slow confidence, boots crunching in the snow. He tugged his gloves off one finger at a time, like a man peeling away patience. "Been a long road finding you," he said smoothly. Eliza drew closer to Jonas, placing herself instinctively between Crowley and the door where her children hid. "What do you want, Matthew?" Her voice was thin but steady. "What's mine?" he replied easily. "You, the children. You belong with me." Her chin lifted. "You left us to die." Crowley tisked, shaking his head like a schoolmaster correcting a child. "Come now, darling. Don't make it ugly. I've had time to think, and I've decided it's clear you and the little ones need structure. A man's hand." Jonas's jaw tightened. His voice was low, flat. "You'll find no welcome here." Crowley turned his gaze on him, weighing him like stock at market. "And you are?" he asked. "The man whose roof they're under," Jonas said simply. Crowley chuckled, low and mean. "Convenient. Widow takes up with a stranger in the woods. Real wholesome." Jonas didn't move, but his silence carried steel. Crowley stepped closer. "I've already spoken with the sheriff in Glenrock. I'm their father by blood, by law. Tomorrow I'll come back with papers. You'll hand them over then." He smiled thinly, mounting his horse again. "One night to say your goodbyes. Don't waste it." The riders turned and vanished into the trees, leaving churned snow in their wake. Inside the cabin, silence fell heavy as stone. Nathan sat stiff by the hearth. Leah clung to Eliza's skirts, and Ben buried his face in her lap. Eliza's hands trembled as she paced, whispering, "What am I going to do? He has the law. I can't fight that." Jonas sat at the table, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "You don't have to fight it alone." Eliza looked at him, tears in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Jonas met her gaze, his expression unyielding. "If he comes for them, he'll have to take them from my hands." The night after Matthew Crowley's visit stretched long and heavy. The storm outside had eased to silence, but inside Jonas Hale's cabin, the quiet felt like a tomb. The children had heard every word. Nathan sat stiff-backed by the hearth, jaw clenched, though his young face betrayed fear. Leah clung to Eliza, whispering if they'd be taken away. Ben cried softly into his sister's lap, too small to understand the weight of law, but old enough to feel its threat. Eliza paced the room until her hands were raw from twisting in her apron. "What am I going to do?" she whispered hoarsely. "He has the sheriff. He has the law. I can't fight that." Jonas sat steady at the table, his eyes fixed on the fire. He let her words hang, not interrupting until the silence itself demanded answer. "You don't have to fight it alone," he said finally. Eliza froze, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. "What do you mean?" Jonas leaned forward, his voice quiet but sure. "I've seen men like him. They think paper makes them kings. They're counting on fear to do the work. But fear only wins if you bow to it. Tomorrow, when he comes, he won't find you alone." Her throat tightened. "You would stand against him?" Jonas's gaze never wavered. "For family," he said, "I'd do more." Tears threatened, but Eliza swallowed them back. Instead, she stepped closer, resting her hand lightly on his arm. "Then we stand together." Morning broke sharp and clear. The sun rose pale over the ridge, its light glinting across the frozen fields. The air carried a brittle stillness, the kind that warned of things to come. Jonas was outside before dawn, chopping wood, checking his rifle, reinforcing the cabin's door. He wasn't preparing for a war, not exactly, but he wasn't planning to yield. Inside, Eliza dressed her children with deliberate care. Nathan was quiet, his jaw set. Leah asked again if they'd have to leave, and Eliza whispered firmly, "No matter what that man says, you're not going anywhere." Ben clung to her skirts, wide-eyed but trusting. By midday, the sound came, the steady drum of hooves. More. This time, Jonas straightened on the porch as 4 riders appeared, Matthew Crowley at their head. His smirk was sharper, his stride confident. Beside him rode Sheriff Tate, known in these parts for keeping his purse heavier than his conscience. "Eliza," Matthew called out, his voice smooth as oil. "I've come like I promised. Time to bring my children home." The cabin door opened. Eliza stepped out, her back straight despite the tremor in her fingers. "They are home," she said firmly. Matthew's smile thinned. He turned to the sheriff. "Show her." Sheriff Tate unfolded a yellowed piece of paper, reading in a bored, official drawl. "By order of the Court of Glenrock, Eliza Cooper is hereby commanded to relinquish custody of her children to their father, Matthew Crowley. Failure to comply, that's enough." Jonas's voice cut like steel. All eyes turned as he stepped forward, placing himself squarely between the riders and the cabin. His shoulders were set, his voice low but carrying. "I know what you are, Crowley. A man who abandoned his family in the dead of winter. You left them to die. You don't get to claim them now." Matthew's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. The law's on my side. Jonas didn't move. The law don't keep you warm at night. The law didn't carry them through the snow. From beyond the trees came other voices. Boots crunched on the snow. One by one, townsfolk appeared, Mrs. Webb, Pastor Connor, old Doc Briggs, and others. They stepped into the clearing, faces set with quiet resolve. We stand with her, Mrs. Webb said firmly, stepping beside Jonas. Pastor Connor nodded. She raised those children with grace when no one else would. Matthew turned, anger flickering beneath his polished calm. This isn't your business. It is now, Jonas said, his voice steady. Sheriff Tate shifted uneasily in his saddle. Crowley, this paper don't mean much if nobody's willing to enforce it. The weight of the crowd pressed heavy. Matthew's eyes darted, his bravado cracking. He spat a curse, snatched the paper from the sheriff, and shoved it back into his coat. Mounting his horse with jerking motions, he growled, "This isn't over." "No," Jonas replied, calm as stone. "It's the beginning." Crowley wheeled his horse, his men following in silence. Snow churned beneath their hooves until the sound faded beyond the ridge. Behind Jonas, Eliza's hand pressed to her chest. Her children crowded close, eyes wide but shining with something new, hope. For the first time, Matthew Crowley had been denied. When the riders vanished into the pines, silence settled heavy on the clearing. The gathered townsfolk lingered a while, offering Eliza soft words, touching the children's shoulders, giving Jonas nods of approval. They didn't celebrate frontier. Folk rarely wasted joy where danger still lurked, but their presence was proof enough. Eliza Cooper was not alone anymore. One by one, the neighbors drifted back down the trail. The snow muffled their departure until only the whisper of trees remained. Jonas stood watch on the porch long after the last figure disappeared, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed toward the ridge. Only when the cold crept through his coat did he turn back to the cabin. Inside, the air was warmer than it had ever been. Nathan sat with his chin lifted, pride flickering beneath the boy's guarded face. Leah clung to her mother, whispering questions in a softer voice now. Ben, no longer weeping, toddled to Jonas and pressed against his leg as if seeking protection. Jonas crouched, resting a rough hand on the boy's head. "You're safe," he said, simple as stone. That night, the cabin glowed with a different fire. The stew pot simmered, filling the room with the smell of onions and herbs. The children huddled near the hearth, their laughter returning in small bursts, as fragile and bright as kindling catching flame. Eliza worked by the stove, her hand steady at last. She glanced toward Jonas more than once, her eyes softening each time. When the meal was done, she set out bowls, and for the first time in years, it felt like a family table. Jonas ate in silence, as was his way, but when Ben leaned against him and reached clumsily for bread, Jonas broke the loaf in half and gave him the larger piece. No words passed, but Eliza saw, and the sight put a tightness in her throat she could not speak past. Later, when the children had drifted into sleep, Eliza lingered at the table. The fire burned low, painting Jonas's face in flickering shadows. "You didn't have to stand up for us," she said quietly. Jonas set down the knife he had been whittling. His gaze held hers across the lamplight. "I did." Her lips parted, but no answer came. For a long moment, silence filled the cabin, not heavy this time, but full, steady. Days passed, and the rhythm of life settled. Nathan rose early, eager to follow Jonas to the barn. The boy learned to carry water without spilling, to use a hammer without bending nails. Jonas corrected him with quiet nods and the occasional grunt of approval. Leah stayed close to her mother, but she watched Jonas carefully, studying the way he moved, the way he spoke little, but always with weight. When she dared, she asked him questions about the woods, about animals, about carving. Jonas answered each with patience he didn't know he had. Ben, youngest of all, was a shadow to Jonas, whether feeding the fire, sharpening a blade, or fetching wood. The boy trailed behind, his tiny boots leaving prints alongside Jonas's broad ones. At night, Eliza's laughter returned in small, uncertain ripples. The first time Jonas heard it, he stopped in his tracks, startled. It had been years since his cabin had echoed with anything but wind. He found he liked the sound more than he cared to admit. But shadows do not vanish so easily. Though the days felt brighter, the memory of Crowley's sneer hung over Eliza. She lay awake some nights, staring into the fire, wondering when he would come again, what trick he would bring next. Jonas, too, carried the weight of it. He sharpened his rifle with more care, stacked wood higher than usual, and listened longer to the silence outside. He knew men like Crowley didn't back down after one defeat. They came back meaner, more desperate. Still, in the quiet between those worries, something had taken root. Around that hearth, in the laughter of children and the calm steadiness of Eliza's gaze, Jonas felt a piece of himself mended. What had been an empty cabin was becoming something more, something he had thought he'd never know again. A home. Spring pressed slowly into the valley, but winter's bite still clung to the mornings. Frost silvered the ground, and the creek behind Jonas Hale's cabin sang louder each day as the ice broke loose. Inside, laughter had become more common. Then silence. Eliza baked bread again. Nathan carried himself taller after each lesson with the axe. Leah hummed as she mended clothes, and Ben's whistle carved by Jonas's hand trilled across the yard until it became part of the place itself. Jonas said little of it, but the change was written in his face. The lines of solitude that had marked him for years seemed softer now, not erased, but eased by warmth. His cabin was no longer a tomb of silence, it was alive. Yet shadows stretch long before they break. One morning, Jonas stepped out with a bucket in hand, pausing as the sound reached him, hoofbeats, measured, unhurried. His jaw tightened. He knew the rhythm before he saw the rider. Matthew Crowley. This time he rode alone. His fine coat was worn at the edges, his face sharper, thinner, as though pride itself had kept him upright through the miles. His horse blew steam into the cold air as Crowley drew rein before the porch. Jonas set the bucket down slowly. His hands stayed calm at his sides. Crowley dismounted, boots sinking into the thawing mud. His stride lacked the arrogant snap it once held, but his eyes still burned with entitlement. "I came for them," he said, voice rough. Jonas studied him in silence. "The court made that decision for you?" Crowley pressed, his sneer returning. "Papers don't change because some backwoods hermit thinks he knows better." Jonas's voice came low, steady. "Courts change. So do people." Behind him, the cabin door opened. Eliza stood in the doorway, steady, unflinching. Nathan, Leah, and Ben were at her side, heads high. None hid this time. "They were never yours, Matthew," Eliza said, her voice cutting cleaner than any blade. "You gave them nothing but fear. You left us to die." Crowley's jaw tightened. "I was their blood," he spat. Jonas's voice hardened. "Blood. Don't keep them warm." Blood didn't split wood with Nathan, or mend Leah's mittens, or put a whistle in Ben's hands. You walked away. That's all the claim you've got. Crowley faltered, his eyes darting from Eliza to the children, to Jonas, standing firm on the porch. Nathan's voice, strong and sure for the first time, broke the silence. "You're not our pa," the boy said flatly. Leah lifted her chin. "Jonas is." Even Ben, clutching his sister's hand, gave a solemn nod. The words hit harder than fists. Crowley staggered back as though the weight of them bent his spine. For a moment his face twisted, torn between fury and something more hollow regret, perhaps, or the simple truth that he had lost what he never truly held. He looked at Eliza one last time, but her gaze did not waver. There was no fear left. In it only finality. Without another word, Crowley mounted his horse. His movements were jerky, stripped of confidence. He dug his heels into the animal's sides and rode off, mud spattering behind him. This time he did not look back. The clearing held stillness after he was gone. Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Nathan stepped closer to Jonas, and for the first time, the boy's hand brushed against the woodsman's arm, not out of fear, but trust. Inside, the hearth burned steady, and for the first time, the cabin felt not like borrowed shelter, but like home defended and won. Evening settled soft over Bitter Ridge, the snow glowing faintly in the twilight. Inside the cabin, the fire cracked steady, filling the room with light that no storm could dim. For the first time since Matthew's shadow had crossed their threshold, the air felt clear. Nathan sprawled near the hearth, sharpening the small hatchet Jonas had lent him. Leah sat cross-legged with her doll, humming while Ben leaned against her, clutching his whistle. Their voices carried no fear, only the easy comfort of children who believed in safety again. Eliza watched them from the stove, flour dusting her hands. A loaf of bread cooled on the table, its scent mingling with wood smoke. She turned, catching Jonas's gaze. He had been watching too, though his expression was as guarded as ever. There. Happy here, she said softly. Jonas nodded. They ought to be. Her hands twisted in her apron. And you, are you? For a moment, Jonas said nothing. He set aside the knife he had been whittling and leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, roughened by years of silence. This place was quiet because I wanted it that way. I thought it was peace, but it was just empty. Then you came. He nodded toward the children, you and them. And I realized quiet don't mean much without laughter in it. Eliza's throat tightened. She crossed the room slowly and sat across from him. The lamplight caught the wear in her shawl, the faint lines of worry around her eyes, but also the strength that had carried her through storm and betrayal. I never meant to stay this long, she admitted. I thought I'd rest, then keep walking west. Jonas met her gaze. And I never meant to want you to stay. The words lingered between them, raw and real. Eliza reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "We don't have much," she whispered. Jonas turned his hand over, lacing his rough fingers through hers. "Got enough." Her eyes shimmered, tears held back by sheer will. "Do you really want us here, Jonas?" "Not just until spring, not until the fear passes, but for good?" He looked at her then, steady and sure. "I already see this place different because of you. I hear it different. Feels like home again." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Eliza's breath caught. "Then say it," she murmured. "Please." Jonas leaned forward, his voice little more than a whisper. "Stay, Eliza, stay. And make this your home. Make us your home." That was all she needed. Her face broke, tears falling freely now as she stood. Jonas rose too, and before words could ruin the moment, she pressed her forehead against his chest, her arms slipping around him. Jonas held her, steady and warm, not with hunger, not with desperation, but with promise. A promise of mornings, filled with bread baking and children's laughter, of nights by the fire where silence carried comfort instead of loneliness. When Eliza finally pulled back, her eyes were brighter, steadier. "We're not surviving anymore," she said quietly. "We're living." Jonas's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, one that reached his eyes. "Then let's keep it that way." Outside, the snow melted in slow rivulets along the porch. Inside, the cabin glowed with something stronger than firelight. It glowed with belonging. The days that followed felt lighter. Winter loosened its grip, and the creek behind the cabin ran faster, its icy chains broken. Buds appeared on branches, fragile but stubborn, and the meadow grass reached toward the sun. Each morning brought small signs of change, as though the land itself was learning to breathe again. Inside the cabin, laughter had become a habit. Nathan carried tools with steady hands, proud each time Jonas offered a quiet nod of approval. Leah followed Eliza from stove to table, learning to knead dough and hum old tunes as she worked. Ben filled every corner with his whistle, sharp and happy, until even Jonas found himself listening for the sound when silence returned. For Jonas, the change ran deeper than chores or noise. He had lived with empty walls for years, telling himself he preferred it that way. But now the cabin held voices, warmth, the press of small boots by the door. He found he didn't just tolerate it, he wanted it. One night, after the children had worn themselves out chasing fireflies by the creek, they tumbled into quilts. By the hearth, Eliza brushed Ben's hair back from his forehead as he drifted off, then joined Jonas at the table. The lamplight painted her face soft, her eyes reflecting firelight and steadiness. "They're safe," she murmured, almost to herself. "Jonas studied her, because of you." She shook her head, but her lips curved faintly. "Because of us." The fire burned low. Eliza's hand brushed across his on the table, a touch as natural as breathing. For a long time they sat in quiet, not needing words. Later, when the cabin had grown still, Nathan stirred. The boy rose from his blanket and padded across the room, bare feet silent on the wood. Jonas sat by the window, knife in hand, whittling. By the moonlight, "Jonas?" Nathan's voice was soft. The woodsman turned, surprised. "You should be asleep." Nathan shifted his weight, scuffing his heel against the floor. "I just wanted to ask something." Jonas set the knife down, giving the boy his full attention. "Go on." Nathan swallowed hard. Is it okay if I call you something else? Not just Jonas? Jonas's chest tightened. He kept his face steady, though his throat felt raw. What's that? Nathan's voice dropped to a whisper. Pa. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jonas didn't speak at once. Instead, he reached out and pulled the boy into a tight embrace. Nathan clung fiercely, his small arms strong with need. Jonas held him close, the roughness in his hands at odds with the gentleness of the moment. Behind them, Eliza stood in the doorway, unseen at first. Her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes shimmering. She didn't interrupt. She only watched, her heart full, as the man who had once been a stranger became something far greater. When Nathan finally pulled back, Jonas cleared his throat. Yeah, he said softly. It's more than okay. Nathan nodded, relief breaking across his face. He returned to his blanket, curling beside his siblings with a peace he hadn't carried in months. Jonas remained by the window, staring into the night. But inside his chest, something long buried stirred, a warmth deeper than fire, stronger than silence. He was no longer just a woodsman. He was part of a family. Spring came sure and steady. The last patches of snow melted along the meadow's edge, giving way to stubborn shoots of green. The creek ran swift and clear, its song louder each day, carrying winter away in its current. Around Jonas Hale's cabin, the land shifted from gray to color, and with it, life changed too. Nathan had grown into his new role with pride, carrying buckets, repairing rails, and swinging the axe with the form Jonas had taught him. His small hands blistered, then calloused, proof of a boy learning the ways of work and manhood. Leah followed Eliza with quiet devotion, her laughter spilling out as she learned to shape dough, to patch quilts, to hum songs of comfort in the rhythm of the home. She no longer asked if they would leave. Her roots were already set in the soil of the cabin. Ben was everywhere. His whistle rang across the yard. His small boots tracked mud inside. His questions filled the air until Jonas could hardly recall the silence he once called peace. And truth be told, he didn't miss it. Eliza herself was changed. Where, once, her shoulders carried only fear and weariness, now they carried hope. She moved with the calm of a woman who had found safe ground, her eyes softening when they lingered on Jonas. For Jonas, the change was deeper still. He had spent years with only storms for company, telling himself solitude was safer than loss. Yet now, when he woke to the smell of bread baking and the sound of children's laughter, he knew the truth. Life had not returned to his cabin. Life had finally begun. One evening the family gathered by the fire after supper. The day had been long with chores, but the cabin was warm, the air rich with the smell of pine smoke and fresh bread. Nathan sharpened his hatchet, Leah mended her doll's dress, and Ben sprawled across Jonas's lap, half asleep but clutching his whistle. Eliza sat at the table, hands folded, her gaze steady on Jonas. "You've given us more than shelter," she said softly. "You've given us a home." Jonas met her eyes, his own voice low but sure. "You gave me one too." The fire crackled, sparks rising up the chimney like stars. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was not heavy. It was full, rich with belonging. Later, after the children were tucked away, Eliza lingered at the hearth. Jonas was there. as always, knife in hand, carving slow and steady. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his shoulder. "Not every family is born," she whispered. "Some are made." Jonas looked up at her, his eyes holding hers in the firelight. He set the carving aside and took her hand, rough fingers wrapping gently around her own. "We made one," he said. And with that, the last wall between them fell. Outside, the night was quiet, the stars sharp above the dark ridge. No storm howled, no hoofbeats threatened. The cabin stood steady, its windows glowing, its hearth alive. Within its walls were not strangers bound by chance, but a family bound by choice. In the end, Jonas Hale, the lonely woodsman, had not just taken in a widow and her children. He had found his life, his purpose, his home, and as long as the fire burned steady and laughter filled the air, no storm past or future could take it away. Not every family is born of blood. Some are forged in storms, in struggle, in the choice to stand together when the world turns cold. Jonas Hale opened his door to a widow and her 3 children, not knowing they would become his forever family. From that night on, the lonely woodsman was lonely no more. If this story touched you, thank you for staying with us to the end. Share it with someone who believes in love, hope, and second chances. Leave a comment, your thoughts matter, and we read every word. Subscribe for more true-hearted frontier tales of courage, redemption, and family. Because sometimes the greatest legends are the quiet ones at home.